What's the scariest thing that's ever happened to you? Story 1 fell into a tree well while backcountry skiing 30 years ago. If a member of my group had not seen it happen and saved me, that would have been it for me. What happened was that I ended up dangling upside down. I fell near the tree and toppled in, and it all happened pretty fast. I suspect the fall may have been caused by snow giving way beneath me, which might explain why I fell toward the tree rather than away from it. If that is what happened, then the tree well caused the fall itself, not just the dangerous predicament that followed. I needed to release my bindings to get out. I had enough core strength to get a hand on one, but no leverage to pop it open. There were no other branches within reach that I could use to climb my arms up. So that is how they would have found my body in the spring, presuming nothing else found me first. I was dangling high enough up that I was clear of the snow, but others are not as lucky. If you auger headfirst into the snow and cannot get free, you have a bit of time, but then you suffocate. I was a New Englander skiing in conditions we do not get back east. Contrary to popular belief, we do get some powder days, but not as many and not with a 10-foot base. An experienced Westerner would not have skied as close to the tree as I did. I was with a pack of locals who wanted to show me a good time skiing off the backside of a major ski area. Fortunately, our leader hung back and kept an eye on the rest of us. It took him a bit to get to me, but he found me and popped my bindings. We both laughed when I fell headfirst into the snow below, but it was a nervous laugh. We both knew I would not have survived if he had not been in the right place at the right time. If you search online for tree well deaths, tree well safety, or tree well escape, you can learn more about the risks, how to avoid them, and how best to try to escape. There are also many sad stories about people who were not as lucky as I was. Story 2, I am a volunteer teacher at a Chinese university for traditional medicine. About a year ago, I was having dinner with a colleague and meeting his family for the first time. The restaurant we were eating at was actually located on campus, and finals had just finished, so the place was filled with future doctors, nurses, and other students studying health and medicine. My colleague's wife was kind, and his son a bit hyperactive, but everything seemed to be going fine. This is where things went wrong. I had not eaten that day, so I was extremely hungry, and I ate a little faster than I should have. Suddenly, a chunk of pork lodged itself at the entrance of my windpipe, and I could not breathe. I thought that I just needed to stay calm and get someone's attention so that they could perform the Heimlich maneuver on me. I put my hands around my neck and tried to show my colleague that I could not breathe, dry heaving the whole time. I will never forget the look of confusion on his face as he asked, completely bewildered, if it was too spicy. That is when I started to panic. I jumped up out of my chair, making noise as several students turned to look at me, all while giving what I thought was the universal sign for choking and looking like I was about to vomit but not making a sound. The students, with no understanding on their faces, turned back to their meals. My colleague began saying things to his wife about getting me a napkin or some water, assuming the food was too hot for me. At that moment, I started to realize that nobody in that entire restaurant knew what to do if someone was choking or could even recognize it happening right in front of them. I realized that I might die surrounded by people studying medicine who had never learned basic first aid. I realized I could pass out in front of my colleague, his wife, and his son, and they still might not understand what was happening or know how to help me. I did not want to die, especially not like that, choking on a piece of pork right after my semester ended, when it could have been prevented if even one person recognized that I was choking. At that point, it had been at least 30 seconds since I last took a breath, possibly longer, and the corners of my vision were starting to blur. I knelt down on the ground and tried to block out everything else. I began massaging my throat, hoping I could dislodge the food myself because I could not rely on anyone else. I was out of options, and although I later learned you can perform the Heimlich maneuver using the edge of a chair, I did not know that at the time. I swallowed as hard as I could, and the food finally dislodged. I gasped for air and survived, but I have never come so close to death before or since. Later, I learned that there is generally little public awareness there about choking or the Heimlich maneuver, despite choking causing millions of deaths worldwide each year. That experience permanently changed how I view traditional Chinese medicine and the medical training environment surrounding it. Story 3. visiting my aunt and uncle in an unfamiliar city where they live on a farm just outside the city limits. I am a night owl and decided to smoke a cigarette on their front porch because I could not sleep. They live in a rural agricultural area outside a city that is relatively well known for violence, and as I am smoking, a random car starts pulling down their massive dirt driveway. I start having a mini heart attack because it is 3:30 in the morning and someone is intentionally driving about a quarter mile to get up to the house. I start looking for rocks or anything I could use to defend myself with right as this car pulls up next to the front door. Just as I am deciding whether to bolt back inside and lock the doors or try to defend myself with the rocks I picked up, the driver slowly rolls down his window. I hear a thud on the pavement by my feet. I drop all the rocks and my completely ashy cigarette and just stare blank-faced at the daily newspaper as the paper delivery driver slowly turns around and continues the rest of his route. Story 4. Over the summer, I woke up to police pounding on my door and yelling for me to open up because they had a search warrant. I opened the door to two police officers with their weapons drawn and a federal agent in a large bulletproof vest marked with federal lettering taking cover beside the door. There were 3 or 4 other officers and another federal agent in the yard next to several police vehicles and a large surveillance van. They pushed me against the wall, searched me, and told me to sit outside. The first agent rushed in, making quick tactical movements through the rooms with his weapon drawn. I asked one of the officers what was going on several times before the words, "child exploitation crimes" landed in my stomach like a crushing weight. I could not comprehend that it was really happening. I have been through difficult things in my life, but I have never experienced the level of confusion and unreality that hit me when I realized the Federal Crimes Against Children Unit was searching my home. I cooperated completely. They took all of my electronics and analyzed them for 6 weeks. Later, a detective called and told me my case was closed, nothing was found, and I could come to the station to retrieve my property. All they knew was that my internet address had been associated with known illegal material downloads. I believe my system was compromised, although the detective mentioned that I could have destroyed evidence before they arrived, which was an incredibly unsettling thing to hear. This happened last summer, and I still experience panic when someone knocks on my door. When I order food delivery, I always meet them outside so they do not knock, pretending I am stepping out for a cigarette by coincidence, even though I am usually standing at the window watching for several minutes beforehand. Story 5. Being followed in a grocery store was one of the most unsettling experiences I have ever had. I was shopping alone on a Friday night and briefly made eye contact with a tall man who appeared to be in his 60s, and there was something about the way he looked at me that immediately made my stomach drop. I brushed it off, assuming I was just paranoid, and continued shopping. Within about 5 minutes, I realized he was following me, showing up in 4 different aisles and never adding anything new to his cart. On the second or third aisle, I saw him licking his lips with the same disturbing expression from before. I managed to lose him for about 25 minutes and thought there was no chance I would see him again. When I headed to the self-checkout line, he was second or third in line among about 7 shoppers, including myself. He let every person behind him go ahead of him, and I realized what he was doing as soon as he let the first person pass. My eyes were wide and my jaw nearly dropped as this continued. He ended up directly ahead of me, and by an incredibly unfortunate coincidence, the next self-checkout available was right beside his. With people lined up behind me, I reluctantly stepped over and started scanning my items. I watched him the entire time, and he deliberately took as long as possible. I finished quickly, and as soon as I passed him, his receipt printed, and he rushed out behind me. In the parking lot, I walked quickly toward my car, only to realize his vehicle was parked 4 spaces away from mine, with nothing in between. He stood there the entire time I loaded my groceries, doing nothing but staring at me with a vacant and terrifying expression. He did not unlock his car or touch his keys. He just watched. The cart return was right next to my car, so I got in and left immediately. As I pulled out, I looked in the mirror and saw him standing by his trunk, still not touching his groceries, staring at my car and smiling. Thinking back on it now, it remains one of the most frightening experiences of my life. Story 6. When I was about 12 years old, my family went to Disney and spent a day at Blizzard Beach. I waited in line for about 3 hours to go down a 120-foot water slide. When I reached the top and was next to go, I made the mistake of looking over the edge and completely panicked, saying I could not do it. The worker pointed out that I had waited 3 hours just to turn around, and I ended up changing my mind. I sat down, leaned back, and prepared for the drop. About a quarter of the way down the slide, I started to lift up, and for a few seconds I was airborne, no longer touching the slide at all. I somehow caught air, and I honestly believed that if I had shifted my body even slightly, I could have fallen out of the slide and been seriously injured or worse. Fortunately, I landed back in the slide, but when I did, water rushed into my nose and mouth, and I struggled to breathe for the rest of the descent. I am fairly sure I had an emotional breakdown while floating in the lazy river afterward. Story 7. I went to Boy Scout camp growing up, and I was probably 14, 15, or 16 at the time this happened. I honestly cannot remember exactly. I used to love it, but the year this happened, I quit. These events took place over 2 or 3 nights. The first night, sometime after midnight, I needed to use the bathroom, and instead of walking to the bathroom huts, I just went outside my tent. There was someone standing at the back of my tent, and I am pretty sure I accidentally urinated on him. He did not say a word. I panicked and zipped myself back into the tent midstream, completely freaked out. Since I still had to go, I exited through the front of my tent and walked toward the stalls. On the way, I saw people raking around the fire pit. I assumed it was my troop, but it was dark. I said hello, but as I got closer, I realized they were not anyone from my troop, and they did not respond at all. From that moment, I sprinted to the bathrooms, finished quickly, and speed walked back to my tent. By the time I left the bathrooms, whoever had been at the fire pit was gone, and the whole thing could not have taken more than 5 minutes. I was confused but went to sleep. The next day I asked people in my troop about it, and no one knew anything. Later that night, around midnight again, I heard something thumping against my tent and thought it was branches falling from trees, but the noise kept getting worse and louder. Suddenly, rocks and sticks started flying into the tent. Someone was deliberately throwing things at us. I woke my bunkmate, and we ran to the troop master's tent and tried to explain what was happening, and in the middle of telling him, more rocks and sticks hit the tent. He ran outside yelling into the darkness, telling whoever it was to stop, which woke most of the troop, and many of us ended up standing together in the middle of the campsite. From there, rocks and sticks started landing all around us. Everyone was panicking, the troop master was yelling, and we were shining flashlights but could not see anything beyond the darkness of the campground. I panicked and ran into the bathroom stalls, and from there the noise intensified, with heavy objects hitting the stalls repeatedly. A group of us stayed there for what felt like hours as things continued hitting the building. I do not remember if it eventually stopped on its own, or if I ran back to my tent, and I do not know if I blacked out from fear or eventually fell asleep. The next day we reported everything to the camp leaders. Announcements were made, but nothing came of it. That night, more rocks and sticks hit the tent, and I chose to ignore it until it stopped. Whoever it was seemed to want to scare us from a distance. I called my dad the next day and told him to pick me up 4 days early because I was done. I quit Scouts shortly after, and we never found out who those people were. I know it sounds unreal, but it really happened, and it remains the most terrifying experience of my life. Story 8. I was day tripping in Dublin with my parents and sister. We went to a busy restaurant called Bewley's, and this was back in the 1990s. My parents were ordering food while my sister and I found a table somewhere in the crowded restaurant. I wanted a specific drink and forgot to tell my mother, so I walked back to the counter and asked her for it. When I turned to go back, the restaurant was so busy that I forgot where our table was and could not find my sister. A woman noticed my confusion and told me I had to come with her, saying my parents wanted me to wait with her. She was sitting with a man. Even though I was about 7 years old, I could tell something was wrong because I had just been with my mother moments earlier. I told the woman no, and right then I spotted the top of my sister's head and sat down. I did not think much of it until things became stranger. My parents returned with food, and while we were eating, the same woman and man walked up to our table. She told my parents they had beautiful children, placed 2 chocolate bars on the table for us, and then quickly left the restaurant with the man. My mother commented that it was strange, and I told her the woman had asked me to go with her and claimed my parents wanted me to. My parents were immediately alarmed, and my father was furious. Story 9. My family and I had recently moved into an old, isolated house at the top of a long, steep hill. One night when I was 12 years old, I was in the kitchen getting a snack and thought I heard branches breaking outside. I turned off the kitchen light to see better through the window, but when I looked again, nothing was there. I assumed it was an animal, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me. The next morning I told my mother, and she said it was probably nothing. That afternoon when she picked me up from school, she told me she had found a set of keys outside the kitchen window. One was a Toyota key, along with another unknown key. No one we knew drove that kind of car, and even if they did, it made no sense for them to be outside our window late at night. My mother went to the police, but all they could do was patrol in case someone returned for the keys. No one ever did, and we never found out who they belonged to. Ever since then, any noise outside makes me rush to the windows. Years later, at the same house, I walked into my dark bedroom at night and saw someone outside my window holding a bright device. Instead of reacting logically, I opened the window and shouted in fear. It turned out to be a young delivery worker dropping off my mother's medication. I startled him badly, felt incredibly embarrassed, and had my brother collect the package. I later realized the device was just a tablet, but at the time my fear completely took over. Story 10. I woke up around 3:30 one night to get a drink of water, left my room, and while walking down the hallway I looked to my right and saw a very dark silhouette in the guest bedroom, darker than the room itself. I stopped, and it stood up from the chair it was sitting in and started walking toward me. I immediately went back to my room and did not leave again until the sun came up. I have other stories about my parents' house too. Another time, I woke up early in the morning to knocking on my door and said for whoever it was to come in, but no one did. Instead, I heard someone walking away and going downstairs into the basement. There was a room directly below mine, and a few minutes after the knock, I heard voices coming from that room, so I assumed it was my parents talking. But about 20 minutes later, my mom woke up and told me that she and my dad had been asleep the entire time. Another night, I woke up around 3 in the morning and heard knocking on my door again. I said for them to come in, but the door did not open. I got up and there was no one there, but a picture had fallen, so I assumed that was what made the noise. I put it back up and went to bed, but a few minutes later I heard another couple of knocks on my door, so I yelled for whoever it was to leave me alone and went back to sleep. One night I was lying in bed with my dog when he suddenly started barking and growling. I looked to where he was staring and saw a dark shadow crouched near my fan, and then it just disappeared. I know all of this sounds unbelievable, but I am not making any of it up. Story 11. Two scary incidents stand out to me. The first was when I was homeless almost 10 years ago. I finally worked up the courage to ask for money and instead was attacked by a drunk man who was bigger than me. It was not a fight at all, more like being jumped. There was no posturing, he just attacked me, had me on my back in the street within seconds, and was landing kick after kick toward my head and neck. He then grabbed my leg and started dragging me toward the middle of the street. I screamed, and two bystanders pulled him off me. That moment shook me deeply. After that, my body changed in strange ways, and it felt like my nervous system had been permanently altered. I also noticed that since that day, something inside me shifted in terms of self-protection, like a switch that could turn off empathy if survival required it, even though I have never acted on that feeling. The second scary experience was much more recent. I hiked a 14,000-foot mountain with my significant other. About halfway up, she complained of a headache, and I should have turned around immediately because I know how dangerous altitude sickness can be. Instead, I told her to keep an eye on it. At the summit, she still had a headache and nausea, and on the way down, she slowed more and more. I realized I had made a serious mistake. I was not strong enough to carry her. Her eyes looked glazed, she stumbled, and she kept asking how much farther it was while I kept lying and saying we were almost there. It took an incredibly long time to get off the mountain, and I assumed she would feel better once we reached the truck. But she did not. She was barely responsive and moaning in pain. We started driving while I searched for a clinic or hospital, and when she said her arm was going numb, I became terrified, even though I did not fully realize it at the time. I began ignoring traffic laws, cutting people off and driving aggressively through a small mountain town while desperately asking strangers for directions, but the signage was terrible and confusing. I spotted a fire department vehicle, but it was empty. I asked a young girl on a bicycle, maybe 10 or 12 years old, where the hospital was, and she said it was about 15 minutes away, then mentioned there were clinics nearby but could not explain exactly where. I thanked her and drove off, pulled into a parking lot, and tried to search on my phone, which was barely working. The same girl suddenly appeared next to the truck and offered to guide me there if I followed her. I agreed and followed her through roundabouts while cutting through traffic to keep up. At one point I asked where we were going and even offered for her to ride in the truck, realizing in that moment how alarming I must have looked, a frantic stranger breaking traffic laws. She calmly gave directions, telling me where to turn and where to go up a ramp. I ended up in a confusing complex with a clinic sign mixed into what looked like a hotel or mall, knocked over a small light while parking, and rushed my significant other inside barefoot and barely able to walk. A stranger offered to help find a wheelchair, and the girl appeared again to point us to the clinic, hidden behind another building. Once my partner was finally receiving oxygen and care, I went outside to move the truck and completely broke down. I did not realize until that moment how terrified I had been. Even later, driving home, I kept crying, especially when thinking about that little girl. My partner recovered and is fine, but I cannot stop thinking about the calm, courage, and clarity the child showed. She helped us multiple times without hesitation, noticing when I made the wrong decision and coming back to help again. I never learned her name, but I hope she keeps that strength and awareness, and I hope I can raise children with even a fraction of that kind of character. Story 12. To give some background, my home was built in the early 1870s, and I have experienced multiple events that I believe were supernatural. The first happened when I was home alone taking a bath. I had locked the bathroom door out of habit because my cats would push it open and let the steam out. While I was in the tub, I heard humming and footsteps coming down the hallway. Then the doorknob began to turn and the door rattled like someone was trying to get in, and then it suddenly stopped. When I got out, no one else was home. The second happened when I was home alone, gaming with my hair tied up in a ponytail. I suddenly felt a hand grab my hair and yank it downward so hard my chin snapped up toward the ceiling. I looked around and no one was there, and it genuinely hurt. The third happened after my parents and I had finished dinner and were sitting at the kitchen table talking. The pantry door was open and our dog was asleep on the floor a few feet away. Suddenly the door slammed shut with enough force that the slats rattled. The dog woke up, her hair stood up, she barked at the door and then ran off. None of us could explain it, since no windows or exterior doors were open, and the pantry door is heavy and does not move on its own. In the same house, my bedroom seemed to be the center of activity. One night I was up late reading and listening to a George Winston compact disc, since he plays piano solos, when my headphones suddenly cut out. I heard a deep, guttural growl directly in my ear and felt hot breath against my cheek, which still makes my heart race thinking about it. Another time, I was home alone again reading in my room. I am very particular about keeping my bedroom door closed because if it is open and someone is on the stairs, they can see a mirror and look straight into my room. I left to get water and made sure the door was closed, but when I came back upstairs, it was open. As I reached the point where I could see the mirror, I saw the reflection of a woman in post-Civil War clothing standing in my room. I ran upstairs and she was gone. Another night I was reading in bed when I suddenly got goosebumps for no reason. I looked toward the foot of my bed and watched as the mattress depressed, as if someone had sat down. I felt the bed tilt with the weight and pressure against my foot through the tight blanket. I calmly asked for it to stop because it was hurting my foot, and almost immediately the pressure lifted and everything returned to normal. From what I can tell, there are two distinct presences in the house. One feels female and kind, while the other feels aggressive. I used to wake up with scratches and large handprints on parts of my body I could not reach, and I often felt pushed, especially on the stairs. My mother later told me my bedroom used to be the parlor for the farmer's wife who lived there. Local records show 2 deaths on the property. The farmer died shortly after his wife and child passed away due to complications during pregnancy, and over time I came to accept the presence that remained. Story 13. When I was in 7th grade, my school had a tradition of taking all the 7th graders to the Statue of Liberty during the second week of school. It was an early morning trip because the lines were always long, and for context, I grew up in northern New Jersey. We were standing at Port Liberty around 8 in the morning, and the ferry was scheduled to leave at 8:30, but it was delayed. About 15 minutes later, I heard a loud roar and looked out over the river to see a plane flying extremely low before it hit one of the Twin Towers. I remember reacting instantly and pointing it out, and the people around me gasped as they realized what was happening. Standing on the ferry deck, we were confused and trying to understand how something like that could occur. Then the second plane hit and fear set in immediately. We knew something was very wrong and that our lives could be in danger. The ferry terminal was evacuated and Park Service officers gathered all the students near the buses. Some kids were openly crying because their parents worked in the World Trade Center. The most frightening part was hearing the roar of collapsing metal echo across the city, followed by an eerie silence. What still haunts me is that when the first tower fell, you could hear the entire island of Manhattan screaming in fear and chaos. We were being evacuated toward Hoboken when the second tower collapsed. Story 14, I was walking my brother's dog on a wooded trail that takes about 40 minutes from one end to the other. About 20 minutes in, a woman walked toward me with a dog leash draped around her neck, but there was no dog with her. Thinking back, we had not passed a dog before or after her. I noticed the way she looked at me and thought about the stories in my area about people stealing dogs and selling them. My brother's dog is beautiful, and I worried someone might see him as valuable. We kept walking, and then a man suddenly emerged from dense woods, stepping onto the trail as if from nowhere, and asked if he could walk with me. I said no, and when he asked again, I repeated myself. He turned and walked back into the forest, which made me extremely uneasy. I tied the leash around my waist so it could not be pulled from my hands. I started hearing branches cracking around me and saw the man dart in and out of view ahead of me, watching from the trees. I am not physically intimidating. I am 5'5", weigh about 130 pounds, have had asthma since I was 5, and cannot run well. I was far from either end of the trail and had no realistic way to escape. That dog is my best friend, and I could not let anything happen to him. The thought of losing him or him being harmed was unbearable. Hearing more movement around me, I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed a large rock, raised it over my head, and started screaming every threat and wild thing I could think of, making myself look completely unhinged. I remember yelling that anyone who wanted the dog would have to be willing to die for him, because I was. Whether they were scared off by how unstable I sounded or decided I was not worth the trouble, I do not know, but we made it back to the car safely. Story 15. I was about 11 years old, around that age in middle school. I lived fairly far from my school and had to catch a school bus that stopped 3 blocks away from my house every morning. One particular morning, I was running late and missed the bus. Instead of going home and telling my mom, I decided to walk to school by myself, even though it was about an hour-long walk. I knew the route and did not feel too worried, so I started walking. About 30 minutes in, roughly halfway to school, I got a rock stuck in my shoe and stopped to take it out. While I was stopped, a taxi driver pulled up to the curb and asked me for directions to a house, showing me an address written very small on a scrap of paper. I stepped closer to look at it but did not recognize the address and told him so. While I was standing there, I noticed he was doing something in his lap, and when I looked down, I saw that his pants were open and he was exposing himself. I immediately ran down the block. Thankfully, there were parked cars along the street, and I was on the opposite side from him. There was an elementary school nearby, and I told the crossing guard what had happened. She called the police, who then contacted my parents. A report was taken, but it was handled poorly. When my mother later followed up, the name on the report was completely wrong because I was wearing a hand-me-down jacket with someone else's name on it, and the officer wrote that name instead of mine. The man was never caught as far as I know, but the situation stayed with me for a long time. Story 16. One day I was on vacation with my family at my aunt's parents' lake house. They lived directly on a lake with a dock in their backyard, and my family brought a jet ski so we could enjoy riding on flat water. When it was my turn to ride, there was another family on a boat nearby towing a tube. They were driving fast and making sharp turns, but nothing that initially worried me. I grew up around water and had plenty of experience on jet skis. After riding for a while, I found myself traveling parallel to their boat in the same direction. I wanted to turn around and head back, but the shoreline was close on my left, so the only direction I could turn was toward the boat. I hesitated, worried that if I turned at the same time they did, we could collide. The boat appeared to be several hundred feet away, but judging distance on water is difficult. After checking repeatedly and seeing that they were still going straight, I decided to turn. Almost immediately, they turned toward me at the same time. Because of their speed and the angle of the turn, I could not see the driver, and they could not see me. Somehow the other driver noticed in time, and I slowed down and turned harder. We ended up stopping about 30 feet apart. It was a close call, and I still think about how badly that could have ended. Later, I had an experience involving a spirit board that remains one of the most unsettling things I have ever lived through. This happened about 9 years ago, when I was in 10th or 11th grade at my friend Jay's house. We were hanging out in his basement with a couple of friends and decided to use the board, which we had done before without anything extreme happening. Jay's basement was unfinished, open, and lit by 4 ceiling lights, each controlled by its own pull string. As we started asking questions, the board responded accurately to personal questions that only one of us knew the answers to. At one point, it claimed it was there to protect someone and spelled out my name, saying it followed me and meant no harm. It also gave a future date when it said it would need to help me, which I intentionally did not try to remember. Eventually, the responses slowed and we started talking among ourselves, forgetting about the board without formally ending the session. Suddenly, the light above us turned off and back on. When we asked if it was responsible, the board confirmed it and said it was upset because it was being ignored. We continued briefly, but once again drifted into conversation. Then all 4 lights began turning off and on in rapid sequence. We ran for the stairs in panic, and as we did, the smoke detectors in the house began going off. The basement door was locked from the outside, and we banged on it until Jay's mother opened it. There was light smoke in the house because someone had burned popcorn in the microwave. After calming down, we realized we still needed to properly close the board. When we returned to the basement, all the lights were on. Before ending the session, we asked what would happen in the near future, and the board responded with the letters OJ. The next day, Jay missed school and later told me he had fainted at breakfast, spilling his drink all over himself. He had been drinking orange juice. That was the last time I ever touched a spirit board, and I have never exaggerated that story. Story 17, I had been working at a Wetzel's Pretzels in 2013 for about 3 months, and it was my first official job. The way those stores are set up is that there is usually one main store and 2 or 3 kiosks spread throughout the mall. On this day, I was working a closing shift at one of the kiosks and was getting ready to shut down, which I remember clearly because my manager was counting money at one of the registers. I was ringing up a customer when I noticed a group of people suddenly running past us. It seemed strange, but I continued helping the customer. Moments later, a much larger group of people ran by yelling, and then we all heard gunshots, about 2 or 3 of them, which sounded like rifle shots. Up to that point in my life, I had never heard real gunfire in person, and I completely froze. I did not know what to do, but my manager reacted quickly, grabbed me, and told me to run. We ran to the main store as fast as possible because it had a back room with a locking door that felt safer. We stayed there for what felt like forever while people around us texted their families, terrified of what might happen next. Our manager kept receiving updates and told us we had to wait until state police arrived. Eventually, state police and tactical units arrived, surrounded the mall, and escorted us out. Thankfully, the shooter did not harm anyone except himself. I was fortunate to be escorted out relatively early because some people had to wait 5 or 6 hours before they were allowed to leave. It was terrifying to realize how suddenly someone you have never met can put your life in danger and how little control you truly have in that moment. It remains one of the most intense experiences of my life, and ever since then, I always make sure I have my phone on me in case of emergencies. Story 18. For context, I was in the military, and we were conducting a training exercise in the middle of the Australian outback. We were very familiar with how planes, helicopters, flares, and other military equipment appear in the night sky. One night, a group of us were gathered near our sleeping area, relaxing and talking before bed, while most of the unit was already asleep. One of my friends suddenly pointed into the sky and asked who was still training at that hour. We looked up and saw 3 extremely bright lights arranged in a perfect triangle. At first, that did not seem too unusual, since illumination rounds can be deployed in patterns. But it was strange because no training was scheduled. As we watched for about 20 seconds, we realized these lights did not behave like flares at all. There was no drift, no smoke, and no flickering. They simply hovered in place, illuminating the ground beneath them. They were not stars, and judging by their brightness and position, they appeared to be 1 or 2 kilometers away and roughly 200 meters off the ground. As we stood there trying to rationalize what we were seeing, the lights suddenly vanished and instantly reappeared several hundred meters away, almost as if they had shifted positions in a fraction of a second. That was when we woke up more people so no one would think we were imagining it. As others joined us, we began hearing jet engines, even though the sky had been completely silent before. As soon as the jets came into view, the glowing lights disappeared entirely. A night or two later, on the final day of training, we were in a more open area with a clear view of the sky, and many of us were awake talking. In the distance, the same 3 lights appeared again, this time much farther away. As more people noticed them, 3 additional lights appeared beside the first set, forming another perfect triangle. One group suddenly vanished and reappeared much closer, crossing several kilometers in what felt like a single second. At that point, nearly everyone in the camp, including officers, was watching in disbelief. One set of lights after another performed the same movement until they were close enough to cast a dull orange glow across the ground where we were standing. After hovering for about 20 seconds, they vanished. Moments later, someone shouted, and we saw them again on the horizon, pulsing and moving rapidly. Jets appeared once more, and as they approached, the lights shifted formation and sped away at incredible speed before disappearing completely. The next day, back at base, I asked an officer responsible for coordinating air support what he thought it was. He admitted he had no idea but said it was impressive to witness. Later, I researched similar sightings and learned about something known as the Min Min lights, a phenomenon reported in that region for generations. No one seems to know exactly what they are. Some explanations never quite fit what we saw, but whatever it was, it remains one of the strangest and most fascinating experiences of my life. Story 19. I grew up in a country that was extremely dangerous at the time, with kidnappings, murders, and organized crime being common enough that people often needed bodyguards just to go out. I was a child then and went to school like any other day. My family was relatively wealthy, and we lived in a large house. During school one day, after finishing a class, I noticed I had missed a call from one of my parents. When I called back, they told me there was gunfire at our house and that I needed to hide immediately because there was a risk I could be kidnapped. While I was hiding, someone came to the school and told a teacher to bring me outside because they were looking for me. I explained what was happening, and the school staff told that person I was not there. He eventually left, and shortly after, my parent arrived with a vehicle and several bodyguards and took me away. We later learned that a criminal organization had been following my family for months, watching our house and looking for vulnerabilities in order to kidnap one of us for ransom or worse. That day they arrived at our home with 4 or 5 vehicles, and several armed men opened fire on the house with automatic weapons. One of my family members was shot but managed to escape. 2 others were hiding while shots were being fired. Some of the bodyguards were killed. Our home was left destroyed, with bullet holes throughout the walls, shattered windows, and extensive damage. That was the last time I ever saw that house. We stayed in a safe location for several months before leaving the country entirely. My name was changed, as were the names of some family members. As far as I know, that organization is still looking for us, and I can never return to my home country. The most frightening part was not knowing my home was under attack, but hearing the gunshots through the phone while I was hiding. For safety reasons, I cannot answer questions or share further details. Story 20. A few days ago, my girlfriend and I went to bed after having an argument. She was upset and went into the living room to smoke a cigarette and watch television until she cooled off. I stayed in bed because I had an early morning, and this kind of situation was not unusual for us. I was lying in bed facing the door and could hear the television playing when I suddenly became very short of breath. I assumed it was just a tight chest and that a deep breath would fix it, but the harder I tried to breathe, the worse it became. I started to panic and tried calling out to her, but only quiet, raspy sounds came out. Realizing something was seriously wrong, I slowly rolled out of bed and began crawling several meters toward the living room. It felt like it took forever. When I finally reached her, she looked down at me with an expression that suggested she thought I was being dramatic or trying to apologize. I knew I was running out of time, feeling lightheaded and fading, so I tried to scream for help. The moment she reached out and touched my hand, I woke up in bed next to her. She was asking what was wrong because I had been shouting for help in my sleep. Everything from the moment my chest tightened had been a dream. We had argued and she had gone into the living room, but when she came back, I was already asleep and then started screaming. It felt so real that I genuinely believed I was dying, and I woke up drenched in sweat, shaken for hours afterward. It was one of the most terrifying experiences I have ever had, even though none of it was real. Story 21. Recently, my boyfriend and I went for a run, and on the way back to our townhouse, we slowed down to walk. My left leg and foot were cramping badly, and despite that, I stubbornly decided to run the rest of the short distance home. As I was about to take off, my boyfriend told me to wait, but I ignored him and ran ahead. I reached home first, and when he arrived shortly after, he walked around the building before coming inside. Once inside, he sat down and told me that the reason he tried to stop me was because there was a man standing near a tree with his head down, smoking a cigarette. As soon as I ran past him, the man put his phone in his pocket, started walking quickly behind me, and smoked faster. When he noticed my boyfriend, he turned and ran through a grassy walkway, repeatedly looking back. My boyfriend encountered him again while circling the townhouse, and the man ran off once more. He also told me that when we first went out for the run, that same man had been standing near a nearby house, staring at me and then at him. It became clear that the man had been waiting for me. I had no idea any of this was happening. I remembered briefly glancing at him when I ran past, but that was it. I did not have headphones in and usually pay attention to my surroundings, yet I never heard him. A few days later, our doorbell rang at 10:30 at night, and when my boyfriend answered the door, no one was there. I think about the situation constantly, and I know that if my boyfriend had not been with me during that run, the outcome could have been very different. Story 22. I have been stalked for over 6 years now. I still have no idea who it is or why, and they have never been identified or caught. When I was still living with my mother, someone broke into her apartment multiple times but never took anything. Before I changed my phone number, I received text messages from different numbers, all clearly from messaging applications, always letting me know they were aware of what I was doing and what my friends were doing. I moved several times and they always managed to find me, until recently. After changing my number again and moving once more, I stayed at a friend's house one night, and the next morning my gas tank had been filled with something a mechanic could not identify. About a year later, after I bought a new car and installed a locking gas cap on the drive home from the dealership, things were quiet for a while. Then one night, while I was home alone, I heard someone trying to get into my apartment. I did not own a firearm at the time, so I grabbed a sword and had emergency services dialed on my phone. Whoever it was eventually gave up, but the next morning my rear bumper had been heavily scratched and the air had been let out of my tires. Since then, I have moved out of my mother's place and into my own home, changed my number again, and taken serious precautions. I now own a shotgun, several knives, pepper spray, and still keep the sword. I am also planning to change vehicles again as soon as possible. So far, things have been quiet at my current place, but I feel like it is only a matter of time before I am found again. I never go anywhere without at least one knife and pepper spray, panic whenever an unfamiliar number calls or texts me, sleep with my bedroom door locked, and keep a weapon within arm's reach at all times. I have never been directly threatened, but the escalation over the years is deeply unsettling. Story 23. A few years ago, my father was nearing the end of a 2-year battle with cancer. Doctors gave him at most a month to live, and between the illness, the medication, and a minor stroke he had suffered, my family and I were preparing for the worst. One night after a long day at the hospital, I came home, showered, and got ready for bed, and that is when something strange began. I started hearing monks chanting in my head, similar to how a song sometimes gets stuck in your mind, except this was a prayer. My family background is Buddhist, although my immediate family and I are largely non-religious. The prayer I was hearing is one used specifically during funeral wakes, and I could not understand why it was repeating in my mind, especially since it had been a long time since I attended a Buddhist funeral. The chanting kept me awake for hours before I finally fell asleep. Less than a week later, I was at my father's bedside when he took his last breath. I was devastated but stayed strong for my mother, keeping myself occupied with hospital paperwork, funeral arrangements, and family notifications, leaving myself no time to grieve. In doing so, I completely forgot about the prayer that had been in my head days before his passing. About 2 years later, in October of 2017, my cousin called to ask how I had transferred ownership of my father's car after he passed. I had seen his parents recently and they seemed fine, so I assumed he was asking for someone else and did not think much of it. That night, I woke up drenched in sweat with the exact same prayer repeating in my head. The next day, I called my cousin, and he assured me nothing was wrong. A few days later, my mother received a call saying my uncle, my father's older brother, was critically ill with liver cancer. We went to the hospital to say goodbye, and he passed away that same night. That was when I first connected the prayer with the deaths of people close to me, although I convinced myself it was coincidence. My father had been ill for a long time, and perhaps my subconscious was simply making connections. On New Year's Eve later that same year, my mother, sister, and I spent the night at home sharing a rare home-cooked meal. Around 2 in the morning, as I was getting ready for bed, the prayer returned, this time accompanied by the smell of burning incense. Panicked, I checked on my mother and sister, then rushed downstairs to make sure nothing was on fire. Everything was normal. When I returned to my room, the scent was there again. I turned on every light and opened the windows, trying to find the source, but there was nothing. The smell and the prayer existed only in my room and only in my mind. When I woke up late the next morning, I saw an ambulance outside my window. The elderly man who lived alone behind my house had passed away in his sleep. Story 24. Two of my friends were spending the night at my parents' house while we were still in high school. My bedroom was one room away from the kitchen, connected by a pantry and a hallway. Late at night, I heard the back door handle jiggle, which usually meant one of the cats wanted to go outside, so I got up to let it out and grab a drink. When I walked into the kitchen, there was no cat there, but I immediately noticed the basement door was wide open, even though we always kept it closed and locked. I shut and locked the basement door, feeling a little uneasy, but brushed it off. Next to the basement door was a staircase leading up to the second floor, which becomes important later. A couple of hours later, I heard the refrigerator door close. I noticed because I did not hear it open, which was strange. But what really unsettled me was that I did not hear anyone walk down the stairs or past my bedroom. The back staircase was extremely loud and creaky, and I would have heard anyone using it. Feeling uneasy, I grabbed a knife and went into the kitchen. No one was there, but I immediately saw smoke seeping out from under the basement door. I opened it briefly and saw the basement filled with smoke, then closed it, woke my parents, and called the fire department. By that point, it was around 4 in the morning, and we were preparing to sleep in the car for the night. A firefighter eventually told us it was safe to go back inside. Somehow the furnace had caught fire internally and was filling the house with carbon monoxide. If my friends and I had gone to sleep, we would not have woken up. I still have no idea what caused the door handle to jiggle or the refrigerator to close, but whatever it was likely saved our lives. Story 25. I was around 10 years old, living in a trailer park and playing hide and seek with my friends. I was running around trying to find a good hiding spot when I turned left around one of the trailers and suddenly stopped in my tracks because I was running straight toward a massive pit bull. I turned to run, but the dog was much faster. It jumped on my back and started attacking me. That was not my last terrifying experience with dogs. A few years later, I was living with my dad in Florida in a wooded mobile home community where each family had their own plot of land. My dad owned a large Rottweiler named Dylan, and I absolutely loved him. That area had a lot of stray dogs that often ran in packs, but they usually left people alone. One day I was riding my bike around our property and reached the end of our driveway, where it met the dirt road that looped through the park. Suddenly I was surrounded by 6 or 7 dogs, all barking and closing in. Dylan was chained up nearby, and in complete panic I called out to him. I saw his head pop up, and somehow he knew something was wrong. He broke free from his chain and charged straight at the dogs, driving them off after overpowering one of them. I will never forget the feeling of seeing my dad's dog turn into a real-life hero. Story 26. I was about 14 or 15 years old when I was babysitting a 5-year-old boy I had watched many times before. He was an easy kid who listened well and never fought bedtime. His parents, however, were a bit intense and very controlling, even before that kind of parenting had a name. I always thought it was strange that they had a baby monitor in his room, but I still used it after putting him to bed. One night while I was downstairs watching television, I heard static through the monitor, followed by the child giggling. I turned the television down and listened more closely, then heard footsteps upstairs and his quiet voice saying hello to someone. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I grabbed a rolling pin from the kitchen and headed toward the stairs with the monitor in my hand. More static followed by laughter came through. Then I heard him loudly ask what someone was doing. As I walked down the hallway toward his room, I heard him urgently tell someone to wait and not leave. My heart was pounding as I reached the door and slowly opened it. The boy was standing at his bedroom window, waving enthusiastically. Trying to stay calm, I asked him what he was doing, and he smiled and told me he was saying goodbye to his friends. I looked out the window and saw nothing at all. No people, no cars, nothing. I put him back to bed and spent the rest of the night sitting at the kitchen table with all the lights on until his parents came home. When his father drove me home, I told him everything that happened. He said nothing, dropped me off, and drove away. They never asked me to babysit again, and I never wanted to go back to that house. Story 27. I experienced sleep paralysis combined with hallucinations. At the time, I was sleeping on an air mattress in the living room of an apartment, so there was a window and a door directly at the foot of my bed. The blinds were drawn on the window, but from my angle I could still see a bit outside. The door had a small window instead of a peephole, and there was nothing covering it. I have fairly severe insomnia, so I take medication to help me sleep. At that time, I was taking 150 milligrams of Seroquel, which usually knocked me out completely, but if I stayed awake past when it kicked in, I would start seeing things, not clear objects, but lights and vague shapes. That night, I fell asleep fairly quickly around 10 or 11 at night, but woke up around 1 in the morning. When I looked toward the window at the foot of my bed, I saw what looked like someone walking past it. I felt nervous and wanted to check whether the door was locked, and that was when I realized I could not move at all. Panic started setting in as I noticed the figure walk past the window again in the opposite direction. Then again, and again, each time feeling like it was getting closer, while I remained completely frozen. The last time it moved toward the door, and I saw someone staring through the small window for a split second before suddenly appearing inside, standing over me. At that exact moment, I jolted upright and the figure vanished. I checked the door and it was locked. I sat there for nearly half an hour trying to calm my racing heart before I could sleep again. Nothing like that has happened since, and I am now on a lower dose of my sleep medication and have not experienced hallucinations like that in a long time. Story 28. I was a very paranoid kid. I loved watching Rescue 911 and playing with rescue-themed building toys, but I was not allowed to watch shows like Unsolved Mysteries or America's Most Wanted because they scared me too much. I was about 9 or 10 years old and home alone during the day when I saw an older car with dark tinted windows pull up in front of our house and sit there. I stood watching anxiously as it stayed parked for what felt like a long time. Eventually, the car pulled into our driveway, and a man wearing a ski mask jumped out of the back seat and ran straight toward the front door. The door was already locked, but I ran to it anyway. And just as my hand touched the lock to confirm it was secure, the man started pounding on the door as hard as he could and yelling that he saw me inside and was going to kidnap me. Our family's golden retriever, who was normally very gentle, started barking furiously and lunging at the door. I grabbed the phone and called emergency services, but I was crying so hard I could barely explain what was happening. The operator quickly understood and told me to shout that the police were on the way and that he should leave. As soon as I managed to say it, the pounding stopped, and I heard the man say he was just joking and claimed to be one of my brother's friends. It turned out to be true. One of my brother's high school friends had seen me through the window and thought it would be funny to scare me. When I opened the door, my usually friendly dog broke free and bit his hand hard enough to draw blood. If that dog was not already my best friend, she absolutely was after that day. Story 29. This happened when I was around 10 or 11 years old during summer vacation. I was incredibly excited because my grandparents had just moved out, and for the first time in my life, I had my own bedroom. My younger brother was nervous about sleeping alone since we had always shared a room, so I told him that if he needed me, he could knock on the wall and I would hear him. A few hours later, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard frantic knocking on the wall. I rushed into his room and he told me he could not sleep because he felt like something was in his room. I lay with him until he fell asleep, then quietly went back to my own room. As soon as I lay down, I looked toward my closet, which did not have doors at the time, and completely froze when I saw a shadowy figure staring back at me. A wave of panic washed over me, and although I had been scared before in my life, nothing has ever terrified me more than seeing that distorted shape watching me. It took everything I had to force myself off the bed and run downstairs to my parents. I broke down crying and shaking in their arms until they agreed to let me sleep with them. Even now, thinking back on it still unsettles me. The next morning, my brother told me he had seen the exact same thing, with pale eyes and an inhuman outline. After that, we continued sneaking into each other's rooms at night for about a year, even though we would get scolded in the mornings. I have had other strange experiences since then, but that first one remains the most frightening. Story 30. I experienced the Christchurch earthquake in 2011. I lived in the city center, which was largely destroyed, and I was at home in my fourth-floor apartment getting ready for work. I heard a strange, deep rumbling sound, and then everything began shaking so violently it felt like the entire building was going to be thrown into the street. I was knocked to the floor as furniture toppled over around me, and if I had been on the other side of my bed, I would have been crushed by my bookcase. When the shaking stopped, I grabbed my phone, climbed over the dryer that had fallen into the hallway, and ran outside barefoot, half screaming and half shaking. I went out the back into the car park where other residents were gathering, all of us confused and trying to understand what had just happened. We did not fully grasp the scale of it until my mother called me, hysterical and crying, saying she had seen collapsed buildings on the news and knew people were dead. She lives 5 hours away, and the call cut off abruptly. Aftershocks kept hitting, and we could hear the apartment building next door, which had already been condemned after the previous year's quake, collapsing internally, so we had to move away in case it came down completely. A neighbor gave me shoes because I could not get back inside without my keys, and we walked together to a nearby park, passing damaged and partially collapsed buildings. People who worked in the city were running toward the park, many covered in dust and blood. I had no idea where my brother was, who had moved to the city just a week earlier, or where my flatmate was, and there was no cell service by then. I sat in the park for hours watching people arrive, hoping to spot them. Eventually, as workers began walking home, only residents remained, and we found each other. My flatmate's building had partially collapsed, and a police officer had to physically hold up part of the ceiling so they could escape. There is much more to the story, but that was the only time I truly believed I was about to die, and then believed the people I loved had died. Even now it feels unreal, yet I work in the city center today in a new building, still surrounded by empty lots and ruins more than 7 years later. Story 31. Last night, my friends and I decided to explore an abandoned house, something we do occasionally. We returned to one we had visited a few weeks earlier, but my best friend felt uneasy the entire time. We had brought some old items to break as a way to blow off stress, and while some of my friends were smashing glass and cleaning up afterward, she kept checking the door, convinced someone was coming. The house was isolated, just off the highway with no nearby homes. After a few minutes, she suddenly saw two figures approaching, both holding baseball bats. The four of us froze for a moment before I whispered that we needed to get out through the window. There were only two exits, the door and one high window. Two of my friends were still in the back room gathering their bags, even though we had no idea who these men were or what they wanted. My heart was pounding as I went back to rush them, knowing my best friend and I were both small and unsure if we could even make it out the window. We managed to climb through and were about to sprint to my car when we heard the men hitting things with their bats. Instead of running, we hid around the back of the building, hoping to stay out of sight. Eventually, we realized the men were young and were there for the same reason we were, and they were just as scared as we had been.